This is the last two PowerPoints in the semester, and today we're really going to focus on some oral health promotion and disease prevention programs that are established and are being implemented within the community. And we can appreciate these more simply because now we know the epidemiology of oral diseases and how certain oral diseases are appearing in particular populations more often than other populations. Then we also talked about utilization and some factors that impact utilization as well. So hopefully looking at these particular health promotion and disease prevention programs, you'll look at it through a new lens now that you have all the background from the first 8 lectures. So this is our lecture outline. We're going to really, in this video, talk about caries prevention. And caries prevention is definitely much more well developed than the other preventions that we're going to talk about in video 2. But as a reminder about community-based services, just wanted to remind you that oral health promotion and disease occurs at both the individual as well as the community level. And what we're talking about in these particular programs that we're going to be talking about here in a minute, it's more of a community level, but we're definitely doing oral health promotion and disease prevention whenever we're interacting with every single patient. The community approach, you will find out it really takes on a prima facie duty, which is part of our ethical obligation. And whenever we take a community approach, we're really looking at it through a lens that has a program has the greatest impact on the largest number of people out in the community. So we're not really focusing on a really small subsection of people within the community on these community-based services. So we have some community-based services out there for caries prevention, which I already said that is a lot more well-developed compared to the gingivitis and periodontal preventions and the oral injuries and the oral cancers that we'll talk about in video 2. So let's talk about fluoride. The first few slides are going to be a review from Dr. Singleton's theory class, so I'm going to go through those slides fairly quickly, simply because they are a review and you've already been tested over that. You will be tested on it again because fluoride is definitely a hot topic that pops up on the boards quite a bit. So you'll be seeing fluoride not only on exam 3 in this course, but you'll continue to see fluoride throughout your time in the program. So let's look at fluoride. We know that there are 4 mechanisms of action for fluoride. Remineralization is the most significant action of fluoride, mechanism of action of fluoride, because through that remineralization and demineralization process, we're constantly going through it. As long as we have teeth that are erupted into our mouth, we always are able to have that remineralization process go on. So it reverses that caries process, and we're utilizing it for our lifetime as long as we have teeth. We do know that remineralized enamel is much more resistant to decay because you have those larger crystals embedded within the enamel. And then I wanted to highlight again, and I said this in theory class, that frequent applications of low concentration of fluoride is the key to remineralization. You don't want to just do a high-powered fluoride varnish within your office or in a public program and then never tell them to follow up on fluoride and taking fluoride. simply because that's going to wear off eventually. So if you have those frequent applications, you're always going to be introducing fluoride into that oral cavity, which is essential for that remineralization process. We also know that fluoride helps with hypersensitivity because it seals off those dental tubules. We also know that it has a microbiology type of basis as well. It messes with the microorganisms um, in terms of those organisms not being able to form the acid whenever you're having the acid attack. And in some other instances, sometimes it actually kills the organism. So it either kills the organism or it inhibits the way that it works, and its byproduct would be the acid. And then finally, it reduces the solubility of enamel. We used to think that this was the most significant mechanism of action, but this particular mechanism of action only helps us systemically and when we have pre-eruptive states. So, we're getting our permanent teeth starting at 5 or 6 and up into our teenage years, and we develop our permanent teeth. And then we're finished with this particular mechanism of action. So we really, during our life course, we're really only utilizing this mechanism of action for a very short period of time. This is where they convert the hydroxyapatite to fluorapatite and embed the fluorapatite minerals within the enamel matrix. And we know that fluorapatite is much more resistant to decay than hydroxyapatite. Then we also talked about acquiring fluoride, so we can acquire it both systemically and topically. And if you think back to that diagram that I had during the fluoride lectures in theory, systemic acquisition of fluoride can be further broken down into two um, uh, subsections, I guess. So we have during mineralization, and that's when the fluoride that is circulating within the blood plasma gets embedded within that developing enamel. And this is the only time that we can have fluorosis that occurs. The other subsection of the systemic acquisition of fluoride is after mineralization, but before that tooth erupts into the oral cavity. And this is when we have larger amounts of fluoride in that surface enamel. So if we take the cross section of the tooth, we would have a whole lot more parts per million of fluoride on those outer surfaces of the tooth. What we do know is that systemically, the uptake of fluoride really depends on how much we ingest and how long we are ingesting it. So we can have fluoride in water. We can get systemic fluoride through dietary supplements, or if we're ingesting fluoride inappropriately from other products. And the other way to acquire fluoride is topically. This is just basically putting fluoride into your mouth and letting your tooth be bathed in fluoride. And we do this on a daily basis when we're using fluoridated toothpaste or mouth rinses. This is what contributes to remineralization. And to reiterate, excessive intake does not result in fluorosis. You can only get fluorosis during that one time, systemically and during mineralization. So let's kind of switch gears and talk about community water fluoridation. Community water fluoridation is the poster child for oral health promotion programs. And the government has developed, and we've talked about Healthy People before. And in 2010, the Healthy People 2010 talked about community water fluoridation, and I pulled this quote from what they said about community water fluoridation. And if you look at Healthy People 2020, they really wanted almost 80% of the United States population served by community water supplies to have optimally fluoridated water. As of a few years ago, only 72.4% of our population currently had that. So we had some work to do, and it will be really interesting when the data starts coming out in the next year or two, hopefully a year or two, whether we met that goal or not. And then Healthy People 2030 should be published sometime soon, because we're already in 2020. So what we know about water fluoridation is that, if you remember, there's no difference in naturally fluoridated water compared to adjusted water systems. So if you have the perfect water system that is naturally fluoridated at optimal levels, it makes no difference if you're drinking that water or if you're drinking the water that where a water system has to adjust that fluoridation where they're either adding in more fluoride or taking it out, as long as it's at the optimal level. I would know the recommendations of water fluoridation. The former recommendation was that range of 0.7 parts per million to 1.2 parts per million. The current recommendation as of January 2011 is 0.7 parts per million with no range. And that's because we now have climate controls like air conditioning and heat. So we don't really have to think about whether we live in a warmer climate or a cooler climate. The EPA has stated that 4 parts per million is the maximum contaminant level. That's when we'll get noticeable fluorosis, one of like more severe cases of fluorosis. So if a water system within a community has over 4 parts per million, 4 parts per million, then we have to defluoridate that water to an optimal level. Benefits, we know that it helps with caries. So early studies showed that it had a significant decrease in caries within kiddos. Now we can only say about 20 to 40% of caries reduction in kiddos, just because we have all these other products with fluoride in them. So we can't really pinpoint and say community water fluoridation is the only type of fluoridation that is contributing to caries reduction. For adults, it's about the same. So we're seeing about 35 to 50% decrease in coronal and root decay, and that's typically due because of that remineralization part. And what we know is when people don't have carious lesions, then they're not going to be susceptible to infection or pain, and their quality of life is just going to be better overall. And then if you're going to look at it from an economic point of view, then it really saves on restorative care as well. Just because fillings are just a simple one surface filling is about $100, if not more now. So we know that community water fluoridation is really cheap compared to that. And we'll talk about that financial part here in a second. So all of that was really a review, but this is something new for you. This is one slide that I would probably star and keep, because these two terms actually pop up quite a bit on boards. But when we're talking about caries reduction, there are two main terms that we have to really think about, and that's dilution effect and diffusion effect, also known as the halo effect. With dilution effect, that's just basically saying that we have all these other products that have fluoride in them. We have toothpaste, we have varnish, we have mouth rinses. So we can't really pinpoint and say that all these caries reduction numbers are solely because of water fluoridation. So we're seeing the decrease in those numbers on the previous slide because we have all these other fluoride products. The diffusion effect, or the halo effect, is basically where a community may be fluoridated, and then a neighboring community may not be fluoridated. So when the community that is fluoridated, when residents come into that community, they get the benefits of community water fluoridation, despite the fact that they may live in a community that doesn't have water fluoridation. So, for instance, let's say I live in a community that is unfluoridated, but I work at U of L, and we know that Louisville metro area is fluoridated at an optimal level. So I work at that place, and I spend 40 plus hours there a week. So I'm obviously going to be drinking some of the water there, or maybe even making my lunch or breakfast if I get there early in the morning with some of the water from the tap. So I'll be getting the benefits of the fluoride because I work in a fluoridated area, despite the fact that I live in a non-fluoridated area. The same holds true with products. So if a product is actually manufactured in a community that has fluoridation, and then it's shipped out all over the world, and some of those places don't have water fluoridation. So if they're ingesting that product, then they're actually getting the water fluoridation because it was made with fluoridated water in that original community. So let's say our community of the Louisville metro area, we develop a certain type of like sweet tea, and we're fluoridated, and we market it, and it hits big. So, we're marketing and we're selling it all throughout the United States. People that live in an area that's not fluoridated, such as Honolulu, that is drinking our special sweet tea that we made in Louisville, Kentucky, that is fluoridated, they're actually getting our fluoridated water. Some other benefits of water fluoridation, if it's at that optimal level, we get those pretty white teeth. And we know that 4 parts per million is that maximum contaminant level, but 2 parts per million is the secondary contaminant level. So we really don't want to go above 2, but at 4 parts per million, that's when it's mandated that a community water system actually defluoridates. And then we know that smooth surface decay has really plummeted overall. So with community water fluoridation and fluoridation in general, it's really impacted the smooth surfaces and reduced the caries there, as opposed to the pits and fissure surfaces. It hasn't done as good of a job on pits and fissures. Other benefits, partial exposure. It really depends on how long you're in a community that has water fluoridation, and how long you're exposed to it. So partial exposure, there are some benefits, but it's really not as good as optimal levels throughout your lifetime. What's really interesting is that there are studies out there that says that once a community, if they decide to defluoridate and discontinue their fluoridation program within their water system, we see dental decay jump dramatically. We recently saw this in Alaska. There was a city, I want to say it was Juneau, Alaska, but don't quote me on that. But a major city in Alaska decided to defluoridate their water system, and a year later their DMFT scores just skyrocketed, and not only the total scores, but that decayed category really increased overall. you'll get a lot of questions about prenatal um, from pregnant women, obviously, about fluoridation in general, but water fluoridation as well. What we do know through studies is that fluoride does cross the placenta, it does enter into the fetal circulation, but with the research that's out there, we know it doesn't harm the fetus, but we don't really know if there's any benefits to the fetus, especially on the primary teeth that are developing in utero. So you really, whenever a patient or friend or anybody that asks you about drinking fluoridated water, there's really no special precautions needed for them. They can drink it, and it's not going to be ill-advised to tell them that they can drink it. In terms of fluorosis, we know in the United States it's pretty much a cosmetic problem, meaning that if you look at the Dean's Fluorosis Index that we just talked about in lecture 6, I believe, you'll see that they're very mild, and mild fluorosis is just like the little white specks on the teeth. And about a fifth of the population, a fifth to a quarter of the population, have those little white specks, where we classify them as very mild or mild cases of fluorosis. Only about 1% of the population in the United States has moderate to severe fluorosis. And typically we see that mainly in the western United States, and that's because their water supply just naturally has higher levels of fluoride overall. What we do see is that these numbers have increased slightly over the years, and typically it is because people are not utilizing fluoride products correctly, especially with supplements. They're not being compliant with dosage, correct dosage, and that whatnot. And then they're also ingesting the fluoride toothpaste at a younger age. And so that's why we're having kind of a fifth to a quarter of the population with very mild to mild fluorosis. Only, they estimate, 10 to 15% of the fluorosis cases can be thought to be due to water fluoridation. But these are generally very mild forms, and they basically say that the hypothesis is that it's not really due to water fluoridation, it's more due to the inappropriate ingestion of other fluoride products. So not only are they drinking fluoride water, but they're also ingesting fluoride toothpaste, or they're swallowing fluoride mouth rinses in addition to that. So that 10 to 15% of fluorosis cases due to water fluoridation, there's some debate about that. In terms of economics, it's really cheap to fluoridate water. It's about $1 per person per year. So if someone lives to be 100, you can think about it from the terms of about $100 will be contributed to water fluoridation over the course of that person's lifetime. And that's about the cost of one filling over time. So you can see that, most people will have more than one filling throughout their lifetime. So water fluoridation, when you're looking at it that way and comparing them, is really, really cheap. The cost of fluoridating a community really depends on several things. How big the city is, the labor costs within that city, what type of equipment's within their water plant, and the amount and type of fluoride that they utilize. There are 3 different types of fluoride products that are out there that are used within water fluoridation. These have been board questions in the past, so I wanted to definitely make sure that we touched on this during this segment of the PowerPoints so that you would have all the information up front. So there are three different types of fluoride compounds. We have the fluorosilicate acid, which is a liquid. It's the most expensive. Then you have the sodium fluorosilicate, which is a solid. And then you have the sodium fluoride, which is also a solid. It's most commonly used, that's why I have the asterisk there, and it's the least expensive of all of the compounds. And when a water company is looking at what fluoride they need to implement within their system, it really depends on the size of their facility, the type of the facility, and then the water engineer actually gets, a large say in that as well. So not only are there three different fluoride compounds, there are three different types of systems for water fluoridation. There are saturators, there's dry feeders, and there's a solution or a liquid feeder. Sometimes you'll hear that called as a metering pump. The saturator actually uses the sodium fluoride. So remember, the sodium fluoride is the least expensive and it's a solid. And what happens is that they put the sodium fluoride into a holding tank. The sodium fluoride dissolves into that holding tank and it makes a saturated solution of water that has fluorides in it. And then from that holding tank, they feed that into the main water supply at a carefully controlled rate. So it's almost like when we tell our patients to do warm saltwater rinses. So you can think of your cup as being the holding tank. You have the warm water in there, and then you take a teaspoon of salt and you dump it into your cup, and then you want to dissolve your salt into your water there, so you would mix it up and whatnot, and then you get a very salty water there. Then to continue that analogy, then you would actually kind of feed that into a main water supply. A dry feeder is actually uses the other solid, the sodium fluorosilicate, and basically what happens is with this is that material, that solid material, is fed into a dissolving tank. And it's not just like plopped into a holding tank and then it dissolves. This solid material is actually like carefully fed in little bits into a dissolving tank at a measured rate by automatic machinery, and then it's carried out to the main water supply. So it would almost be like, I'm trying to think of an analogy here, where you're like drips. You're dripping in the solid material. So think of it like a Hershey Kiss or something, and then you're putting it into a water supply, and then it goes into the main water supply. So it would be like drip, drip, drip of a Hershey Kiss. I don't know if that analogy made any sense, but I hope it did. And then finally we have the liquid feeder, and that uses the liquid fluoride, which is the hydrofluorosilicate acid, and basically they make a saturated solution with water and that fluoride compound, and then they feed it directly into that main supply at a carefully controlled rate. All of this boils down to that whatever type of system and whatever type of fluoride compound that we're utilizing, each limits the amount of fluoride that's added at a very carefully controlled rate so that the water system doesn't become over-fluoridated. And it's also important to note that these all these systems are compatible with other processes that our water company does as well. So it's not interfering into anything. Now, we talked about fluoridating water supplies, but we need to also talk about defluoridating water supplies because there are some communities out there that have above optimal levels. We have two different methods that we can defluoridate at, and both of them are much more costly to defluoridate water supplies compared to fluoridating a water supply. The two different methods are additive and adsorbative. So basically, with additive, you put chemicals into your water supply, and the chemicals react with the fluoride within the water, and it creates a solid. And it settles down to the bottom of those water tanks, and then you can kind of scoop it up and take it out of the water supply. With adsorbative, basically you're putting the chemical into the water and it interacts with fluoride. So there's an ion exchange with fluoride or some type of chemical reaction. And basically it just deactivates the fluoride molecule. So you're not actively taking out the fluoride from the water with adsorbative. You're actually just deactivating those fluoride compounds that are in there. So they're still kind of floating around in deactivated form. The cost of defluoridating water supply is about $2 per person. And of course, we've already talked about that maximum contaminant level. When you live in a community or you interact with a community that's not fluoridated, you may get into the debates of introducing fluoride into the community and advocating for community water fluoridation. And when you look at decisions that have been made, these decisions to fluoridate a community or to not fluoridate a community is not typically on the professional side, dental and medical professional. It's usually very political, unfortunately. And we all know that a lot of times our politicians don't have that dental background that we do. This is also very important. The 3 ways to approve water fluoridation pops up on boards quite a bit. So this is another slide that I would mark and star. So if you are part of a professional organization and you all are trying to get your community fluoridated, there are 3 different ways that you can go about doing that. There can be an administrative decision, which just basically means that the local government, like Louisville Metro Council, will decide, hey, Louisville needs to be fluoridated. So because of this, we're going to talk about it, and then we're going to make a decision as to whether Louisville needs to be fluoridated or not. So a small group of people are actually making that administrative decision on behalf of their constituents. The second way to approve water fluoridation is a referendum. And this is basically where the decision to fluoridate a community is put on a ballot. So you actually have like this little, at the end of your ballot when you vote for your new congresspeople or your president or whoever you're voting for that round, at the end they'll put a proposal on the ballot, and then the people that are actually voting, the community members that are actually voting, will actually vote yes, we want community water fluoridation, or no, we don't want community water fluoridation. And then the third way is state legislative action. This is where our state senators and our state representatives go to Frankfort or they go to Indy. And these legislators have bills that are introduced into the political arena, and they vote on the bills as to whether the public water supplies need to be fluoridated within that state. I want to point out the fact that these decisions are always done on a state or a local level. The federal government does not want to touch this with a 10-foot pole. And they really leave it up to the states and to even kind of further break it down into communities themselves, simply because the community and hopefully the state will actually know the needs of the members of that state, the citizens of that state or that community. What we have seen is that we're not seeing a whole lot of communities actually kind of taking on these fights. Oh, I went a little too far. So adoption of fluoride has really slowed in recent years, and that's partly due because that political arena, this issue is very controversial, especially during election years. Legislators don't want to touch that with a 10-foot pole either, because they want to be reelected. So, they're going to try to stand away from any kind of controversial issues. Low voter turnout, especially if the decision to fluoridate is based on a referendum. And when you have people that are not going to the polls, then you're not really getting an accurate representation of what people really think in that community. Usually you have people that come out to vote are really passionate one way or another. So then you have all these people in the middle that really, they're neutral. They don't really come out. They're not driven to go to the polls to vote on that particular issue. We're also seeing a little bit of apathy in terms of not only with the public, but professionally. The dental profession, we're seeing a little bit of apathy there in terms of really taking on that cause. And then fear and confusion also always plays a huge part. There's a lot of misinformation out there on fluoride. What we do know is that group that opposes fluoride in our water system for various reasons, we call them the anti-fluoridationists, and they're very, very vocal, especially when this topic is brought up. And as a result of all these fights that we've had with the anti-fluoridationists, fluoridation and community water fluoridation is one of the most well-researched public health measures that are out there. So we have very solid evidence out there that support the fluoridation of community water systems. So there are several rationales for not fluoridating community water systems that the anti-fluoridationists utilize. And the most common reason is that anti-fluoridationists says that it violates their personal liberty or individual rights. So they basically say it's unconstitutional. And the constitutionality has been upheld by the United States Supreme Court based on two legal arguments. And I do want to say that this issue has been brought before the United States Supreme Court a ton. And specifically, it was brought up 13 times between 1954 and 1984. So a 30-year span, they saw 13 cases come across that. At the time, the Supreme Court in 1984 said, we're not hearing any more cases on this. We're not hearing any more arguments on this issue again. What would be really interesting is that, of course, we have newer or we have different Supreme Court justices that are sitting on the Supreme Court now. So I don't know exactly how they feel about that. So they may actually be starting to hear those types of arguments in those cases again. But at one point they said we're not hearing any more cases on this. And that was because they said that fluoride's a nutrient. It's not a medication, so the government's not medicating people. It's naturally present in the environment, in our rocks and soil, and you can think of it as a nutrient like a vitamin C or vitamin D. And the other argument that they said was that no one's forced to drink the fluoridated water. So they're really kind of doing what's in the best interest of the greater good of the community. And if you don't agree with that, then you're not forced to drink it. The second rationale is that it violates religious beliefs. And what the Supreme Court said is that there's a huge difference between having certain beliefs due to your religion and, and actually practicing on those beliefs. And if practicing your belief system harms public health and welfare for the general population, then that practice is going to be overridden. And you don't have the right to do those practices and impart your beliefs and the practices of those beliefs on other people. The third rationale is environment based. They're saying that you're basically poisoning the environment, and the environment is sensitive to fluoride. But we all know that fluoride's a natural element. We see it naturally occurring in our rocks and our soil and our water system already. The fourth reason is more of the anti-regulatory attitudes or the governmental mistrust. And you see this with people that kind of buck the mandatory seatbelt laws or the helmet laws, people that talk about guns and, right to arms and those type of things. So they don't want the government to basically tell us what to do because they don't trust the government. So they don't want the government to step in and say we have to have fluoride added into our water system. For instance, my dad is a no seatbelt type of person. He refuses to wear his seatbelt. So he would actually fall into this category concerning seatbelts. And he's been pulled over multiple times. He's been ticketed multiple times for not wearing a seatbelt, and he just pays the fine and goes on because he really just doesn't like to be told that he has to wear a seatbelt. I know, it's crazy. So anyways, the fifth rationale is health concerns. And if you Google fluoride, probably in that first Google page that you see, there are going to be lots of kind of links to health concerns and fluoride. So it's been linked to pretty much everything. So some people will argue that it causes cancer, or it causes Down syndrome or Alzheimer's. Some people will say that fluoride actually causes infertility. Some people actually say that it causes pregnancy. I haven't quite figured that one out yet. Some people have linked it to HIV and AIDS. So we just have to teach our patients and teach our community to be very critical of the sources that they're reading. And then finally, and this is where the professional apathy, I think, kind of falls into play here, is that people argue that our dental health is improving anyways, and you can see that in the numbers where edentialism is decreasing, caries rate is decreasing, more people are going to the dentist compared to the 1940s and 50s. So why should we take that additional quote-unquote risk of fluoridating a water system? So let's just kind of avoid that argument, and as long as we can continue to see an uptick in dental health, then that's good enough, is basically the argument there. If you live in a community that does not have fluoride, there there are some steps to be successful, and this is, again, another important slide. The first and foremost thing that you need to do is to have an organized community support from not only your professional societies, but your other groups, like your other medical leaders. This is the best way to start. You don't want to be the village crazy person over there spouting off about community water fluoridation and then have no support behind you. There's power in numbers. So if you get these other groups on board, your ADA, your KDA, your KYDHA, your ADHA, your CDCs, your Kentucky Oral Health Coalition, there's so much more power when you have all of those groups that are coming together for the single mission to fluoridate that community. Once that is established, then you want to reach out to that particular community. And if you engage the community leaders, people that are well respected within that community, then that idea kind of trickles down to just the community members. We also want to implement low pressure education programs. So we want to talk about fluoride and how it's beneficial and alleviate some of those fears that are out there. We need to educate not only the public, but we need to talk to the legislators or even the council members within that community. And along with educating, we need to develop a long-range plan for community education as well as active action. The one thing that you do not want to do at all costs is you do not want to have a public debate with an anti-fluoridationist. It's not effective. You're just confusing people that are not in the know at all. So you're getting your side out, and you're citing scientific research and well done research and whatnot. But the anti-fluoridationists also have a platform to talk about their stance. So, and they're going to be talking about it very passionately, and they're going to be, saying this research has done this and this research says this and whatnot. And they can be very convincing about that. But when you look at that particular research, it's not credible. So you need to really kind of deconstruct that research overall. And general public is not going to take the time or the effort to do that if they have those capabilities. Some other current issues, bottled water. When we saw bottled water hit the market and it really became popular, we saw an uptick in carious lesions. We know that bottled water, most do not contain optimal levels of fluoride, if they contain fluoride at all. I put nurserywater.com up here because you're going to have a lot of patients that are newly pregnant or becoming parents, and they're going to ask you about mixing formula with tap water if the water system is fluoridated. So this is a good option if they're really concerned about fluoridated water. Nursery water, you can get it in two different forms. One has low amounts of fluoride in it, so they're not getting like the 1 part per million, but they're getting lower amounts, so that might be alleviate some of the parents' concerns of like over fluoridating their child. And you can also get nursery water without fluoride. If my patients were really concerned about mixing formula with bottled or with water that was fluoridated, sometimes I would tell them to kind of alternate. So do one bottle that actually had the fluoridated water, and then if you're concerned about it, then do the next bottle without fluoridated water. So that, that you have to be reasonable with your patients. Some home water treatment filters systems, we know that some of them can decrease the fluoride content, and people should have their fluoride levels tested overall if they're really concerned about it. And then they can go on the ADA website and look at the products that actually remove fluoride in terms of the filters. So, in summary, with water fluoridation, it's cheap, costs $1 per person per year. Everybody benefits as long as they're drinking water, so it doesn't matter if you're the poorest of the poor or if you're the richest of the rich. It doesn't matter if you're 2 or if you're 99 and a half. It doesn't matter if you're black, you're white, you're yellow, you're orange, you're brown. It doesn't matter. If you're drinking water, you get that. And you don't have to do anything additional to get the benefits of fluoride. So all you have to do is drink the water. The barriers is that it's very political, it can be controversial, and you do need that central water supply. So you have to have people that actually man that water supply overall. If community water fluoridation is not an option within a community, we do have some other options that we can go and we can advocate for. One option is school water fluoridation. This was developed in the 60s, and basically the thought was to use it in rural schools that had non-fluoridated water supply and had an independent water supply. So it had to be, the schools had to be in a community that was not fluoridated. So basically they would fluoridate the school water that had, because the school had that independent water supply. They would fluoridate that at a greater level than the community water fluoridation level recommendations. And that is because kids are not starting school until 5 or 6, and they're not there all the time. So they're only there during school hours. So you can increase that parts per million within the school water fluoridation to 4.5, which is optimal concentration for the school water fluoridation because of those two things. We do know that it's much more effective on late erupting teeth, both systemically and topically. So think about when you're developing those tooth buds and developing your permanent teeth pre-eruptively, and you start school at 5 or 6. So you're actually starting to get your centrals and your laterals already erupting at that point. So it's really not going to have a systemic effect on certain teeth. Molars and those late erupting teeth will actually get the benefit of school water fluoridation. Tax dollars funds this, and it's maintained by somebody within the school. They have to monitor it daily. Advantages: everybody within the building, adults like the teachers or the administration and the school-aged children actually benefit from it, and all they have to do is drink the water from the school. But disadvantages: those benefits really begin very late, and you only get it intermittently. You get it 5 days a week for between the hours of 8 and 3, or whatever the hours of that school actually is. You don't get it on Christmas break and spring break and summer break, those type of things. You cannot have school water fluoridation with a consolidated school system. A consolidated school system is formed when you have 2 or more school districts that come together. And you shouldn't have school water fluoridation with those simply because of the risk of over fluoridating is greater there. Only school children benefit, so your preschoolers and your toddlers are not benefiting. You do have to have somebody within the school that's monitoring and that's knowledgeable about monitoring, adding in that water fluoridation. The studies really are not super conclusive. The few studies that have been done says that there's a 20 to 30% effectiveness, but there's not been a whole lot of studies out there on this. So this is not the most optimal option compared to school or community water fluoridation. And then there's been some spills and some safety issues in the past, so the CDC really is not advocating for this any longer. Another option is fluoridated salt. Just like how our salt within the United States is iodized, we can actually add in fluoride as opposed to the iodine. So we started to add iodine to our salt because we were starting to see an uptick of goiters on around the thyroid and whatnot. So once they added in the iodine into the salt, then we started seeing a decrease in goiters. So you can do the same thing with fluoride and salt. So this started out in Switzerland in 1955, and now over 30 countries throughout the world have implemented the fluoridated salt method. And basically, it's just you're adding in a high concentration of fluoride to the salt. And that's about 250 parts per million of fluoride. It's great because it gives the consumer a choice. So people that like salt, that need fluoride, this is a great choice for them. For people like me, I hate salt. I don't put salt on anything really. This would be a poor choice for me just because I don't utilize salt very much. This is a great modality for developing countries that don't have a community water system or piped water to their community citizens. But the studies that have been done and conducted really show that the caries reduction is very similar to community water fluoridation. There are some concerns, especially in the United States. If you think about your patients that you see within clinic, almost all of our patients that we see in our clinic have hypertension issues. And when somebody has hypertension, they're really supposed to limit their salt intake overall. So this would not be a good choice for them systemically. It doesn't take into account water fluoridation as well. We could fluoridate our milk. This is not very common in the United States, but we see this in other parts of the world. It's not as common in the United States because we have a lot of dairies in there and throughout the United States. And it would be really hard to monitor and kind of mandate those dairies overall, and to make sure that dairy A is fluoridating their milk at an appropriate level, utilizing these guidelines, and then dairy B that's down the road is doing the same exact thing. It's really hard to monitor that. Also, we know another issue is that young kids drink a lot of milk overall, but as we age, we tend to decrease our milk intake. So older people are not going to be getting the benefits, especially topically, if you had the fluoridated milk option. And then one that I didn't put up actually on the slide is that we have a lot of lactose intolerant people, it seems like. I'm hearing it more and more and more. That people are having some issues with lactose. So that would be a huge issue for those people. Other sources of fluoride we've talked about in Dr. Singleton's class, the dietary supplements. You have to have your water tested before you are prescribed the supplements. The supplements are a prescription. The biggest issue is compliance and taking that every single day in the appropriate doses. Yeah, of course, we have fluoride mouth rinse, we have over the counter, and we also have prescription mouth rinses. We used to do fluoride mouth rinses a lot in the community schools when they had a fluoride mouth rinse program. That's kind of given way to fluoride varnish. So we're utilizing fluoride varnish a whole lot more in our fluoride programs. Overall, especially in our schools, it's really safe and easy to apply, as you all saw last semester. It's relatively non-messy, it's cheap, it's you don't have to apply it as frequently as what you would do with a fluoride mouth rinse program in the schools, where you would have to do that once a week. Varnish, you would do it once every 6 months. So it's not as disruptive to the classrooms. And then you can also teach non-dental personnel to apply the fluoride varnish as well. And Dr. McKee today, whenever she was talking, talked about educating public health nurses to be able to do this. So we're getting more personnel to be able to apply the varnish. If you are asked a question on your boards and community water fluoridation is not an option, and it asks what the next best fluoride option would be, I would always lean towards fluoride varnish, simply because of those reasonings I just said. It's easy, it's safe, it's relatively cheap to do. And then, of course, we talked about the fluoride toothpaste and the topical fluorides and the home fluoride gels and pastes that are prescription based. So all of that is to say that that is one aspect of caries prevention programs that we have out there. And we have different modalities of how we can implement fluoride within a community. But that's not going to get the whole tooth. We know that fluoride helps with smooth surface decay. But what do we do about the pits and fissures? Well, what you know from dental materials is that dental sealants are ideal for that particular part of the tooth. So dental sealants, in the ideal world of doing caries prevention health promotion programs, we would have both sealants and fluoride being applied. And Miss Deaton talked in her talk today. She talked about how her particular health department actually does both sealants and fluoride varnishes, which is great. Not all 9 health departments within Kentucky are doing both of those. And the reason is dental sealants is costly. It's not only do you have to think about buying the material, you have to think about getting your curing lights if you have that type of material where you have to cure it. You have to have like a suction, some type of suction system, so you would have to use portable or mobile equipment. So you have to have a good suction to be able to keep that filled dry so that the sealant will actually adhere to the tooth. You have to have people that have a dental background to be able to apply it. So you don't want a public health nurse to apply your sealants because they haven't been trained to do that. So that's where you get your dentist and your dental hygienist. You have to have them to be able to implement a dental sealant program. So this sealants are typically targeted to the underserved due to all those upfront costs. However, potential savings in the long run is very great. So we just have to get people to wrap their heads around the fact that yes, there's a lot of upfront cost, but in the long run, it could be the best thing ever. So advantages, it's school-based and you can use mobile and portable equipment. They're super effective if they're applied correctly and they're fully retained. They don't pop out. What we know is that through the CDC, they published that children that are aged 6 to 11 without Silence have almost 3 times more cavities on their first molar than children with Silence. We also know that this is a very effective intervention, but it's underused, obviously, and less than half of the children that are age 6 to 11 have dental stillance. And whenever you're looking at particular groups within the children in that age range, low-income kiddos are 15% less likely to get stillance and twice as likely to have untreated cavities, which we saw in our epidemiology lecture. It's a huge savings in future dental treatment overall. The CDC says that each tooth that is sealed saves more than $11 in dental treatment cost, and that applying sealants in schools to the nearly 7 million low-income children who don't have them, it could prevent more than 3 million cavities and save up to $300 million in dental treatment cost. So we need to be able to formulate a very persuasive argument that those upfront costs will be beneficial to our future generations. Disadvantages, obviously, we talked about it's very costly. You have to have the dentist and the dental hygienist to be able to apply the sealants. And honestly, it really kind of depends on your state dental act, practice act. Some states won't allow hygienists to apply sealants unless a dentist has treatment planned a sealant and has examined that patient in particular. So, really you have to, when you do a sealant program, you have to adhere by that state's laws and regulations. And then you also have to have that adequate equipment. If you've ever used portable or mobile equipment, you know that it's not ideal and the suction is awful. So it really does present some challenges there. Caries prevention programs, like I said, in the ideal world would include both sealants and fluoride. So cost effective, if you're looking at long term, it would have both sealants and fluoride because you're protecting the entire tooth. You're protecting the smooth surfaces as well as the pits and fissures. Typically, dental sealants get left off though because of all those costs associated with starting up a program. So that's our caries prevention programs. It is much more developed than what we're going to see in video 2 when we're talking about perio prevention, injury prevention, cancer prevention, and where do we go from here.